So this is the fourth night in our retreat, and the topic of tonight's talk is compassion. Last night I spoke about how I didn't really know loving kindness until I'd had some good friends or had a sense of affection and remembered my mother's love and my family's love. And I didn't really know joy until I experienced some joy. And equanimity was a slowly growing and maturing quality of wisdom. But I also said that it was very easy for me to cultivate compassion when I was a young monk, because I had a lot of suffering, I think. I remember it distinctly. It was very easy to have a feeling of compassion towards another. All I needed to do was to experience my suffering and then look at another and think, they are just like me. They are human just like me. They also have suffering. They also wish to be free from suffering. And therefore, compassion would arise in my heart. I must admit, I think I wasn't so clear on self-compassion at that point, but I'm very clear on it now. I know that I can experience self-compassion because I feel that there's no difference between the other and myself. Compassion is, and I quoted this earlier, the sensitivity to suffering and the wish to alleviate it, regardless of who it seems to belong to. It is simply that, sensitivity to suffering and the commitment to alleviate it, as I'm just quoting His Holiness the Dalai Lama there. So, if you remember the other night, I spoke about compassion as being this sensitivity to suffering and the commitment to alleviate it. And we spoke about near and far enemies of compassion as well. And I'll just reiterate those near and far enemies. The far enemies are, of course, cruelty, masochism, sadism, and all forms of that kind of wish for another to suffer, or wish for yourself to suffer. That kind of is the direct opposite of compassion. And I also spoke about the near enemies of compassion being these qualities that look like compassion but are false facsimiles. They're false representations. They are in fact not compassion at all. And these near enemies are qualities such as patronising pity, rescuing someone out of aversion for their suffering, like you can't stand their suffering, it makes you feel bad, so you go in and rescue them. Or in rescuing them, that makes you feel good somehow. And I think that those of us who work in the health field may be a bit vulnerable to that sometimes. Another form of the near enemy of compassion is when we get overwhelmed with the suffering of the world. Not dissimilar to what we describe as burnout in the health field. Like, I don't know if anybody else has felt this, but for those of you who work with individuals, where you just get to a point where you just can't, you don't want to hear another horrible story, you don't want to hear another mention about how terrible things are, how much suffering people have, and you just seem to get kind of vagued out, like you're cut off, disengaged, overwhelmed. You just can't stand it anymore. I feel that is sometimes called compassion fatigue, but in reality it's more like empathy fatigue. Empathy fatigue. So these are the defining features of compassion, and in compassion-focused therapy, Paul Gilbert and others talk about there being three flows of compassion. And I think it's a nice way to describe it, because it gives us a sense of practicality about it, I suppose. And these three flows are self to other, like one has compassion for another; other to self, therefore meaning that someone has compassion for ourselves and we feel it; and self to self. They're three flows, and I think they're very helpful to define those three flows, because we can refine our skills in regards to cultivating compassion, and we can be sensitive to when we're receiving compassion and so on. So I said earlier that to know compassion we really need to know suffering, and I mentioned briefly, well, more than briefly, on the first evening, it was quite a bit of. I spoke quite a bit about dukkha. If you remember that term, unsatisfactoriness. Anyway, as it turns out, there are three forms of dukkha described in the text and in the teachings. The three forms are dukkha dukkha, like gross suffering. It's called dukkha dukkha. The dukkha of change, and the dukkha of clinging to a self, clinging to an idea of self. And I'll just explain these a little bit further. Dukkha dukkha is the gross stuff. It's like the stuff we've witnessed this morning, when Monique got the news that she needed to go down to Adelaide to see her mum. She's dying. It's the dukkha of death. I've experienced death, not personally, but I've experienced death. Death is dukkha. I remember distinctly realising this when my brother was dying. He died of cancer when he was 56, which was about 9 years ago. Going through that was dukkha, not only for him, because he was losing everything he knew about. He knew of himself. He was losing himself. He was dying. But it was also dukkha for everyone else. Like, I've got two sisters and a brother and lots of nieces and nephews, and my brother has a partner and he has a child. And you could see the pain in everyone's experience. It was dukkha. So that's the gross stuff. The gross stuff includes mental torment, like the sorts of things that we'll often see with people as clinicians. People going through horrible experiences. Their level of dukkha is just really quite severe. And sickness, I mean, we all have sickness, and sometimes it's quite difficult to bear, unbearable. This is the dukkha dukkha. And I remember listening to the talks in Thailand by the Achans. They would talk about dukkha, and it's like saying, when you feel like you can't stand it any longer, it's just unbearable. That's dukkha dukkha. I think you get the idea, yeah? It's the pretty horrible stuff, the stuff that we find in hell, the hell of our own consciousness and people's consciousness. So the second dukkha is the dukkha of change. And I mean, I experienced that, which could kind of tip over into the gross dukkha. The dukkha of change is like the dukkha of aging in some respects. It's not really severe, but there's a slow progress of reduction in our capacities. As I'm growing older, I I didn't start to wear glasses until I was 42. And a couple of years ago, I had a free hearing check with the NHS in England. And they said I qualified to have some hearing aids. So I thought, oh yeah, okay, I'll try them. And I don't really need them, but the more I use them, the more I don't lose the neurons that are perceiving high frequency ranges, in particular women's voices. And so it's quite helpful for me to wear hearing aids when I'm talking to women, because they might say something and I'll mistake it as something completely something else. I mean, I won't tell you what I've mistaken women saying sometimes, but it's because of the deterioration in the natural age-related deterioration in my high-range hearing. Anyway, there I go again. Anyway, but there's this slow progress of change, aging. I can't bend my knees like I used to bend my knees. I can't hop, skip and jump like I used to hop, skip and jump. I'm starting now not to be able to ride my bicycle like I used to ride my bicycle because I get chest pain. You know, my arteries are all clogged up from a genetic condition. There's this kind of gross change. But also there's even a more subtle change, and I often refer to this as the suffering of sitting on Wadago's Beach. You guys might not know Wadago's Beach. Some people may know Wadago's Beach. It's a beautiful beach. It's the beautiful beach of Byron Bay. Byron Bay main beach is pretty nice. Byron Bay town is not very nice these days. It's getting too touristy and commercialised. But the beach remains really beautiful. And Wadago's Beach is a longboard beach. And I can't profess to be very skilled at riding longboards, but sometimes I do. And get out there and it's so beautiful. Dolphins and whales, sitting on the beach. And some people actually own houses there. They own houses on Wadago's Beach. I don't know how much they pay for them. Like in the millions, I'd say. Like 3 or 4 million at least. But I think most of them own it and then rent them out and get like millions a week or something like that. What I'm talking about here is that's dukkha. Sitting on Wadago's Beach, having a beautiful chai soy latte, with just going out on the board, sitting amongst the dolphins, and just kind of like the sun of the autumn. The autumn sun in Byron Bay is really beautiful. It's not too hot. It's just warm. It's lovely. That's dukkha, because it's going to change. It's going to change. It doesn't last. You know, all the good things that we have don't last. So even the ice cream, even the beautiful meal that we have, even our wonderful relationships can be dukkha. That's the dukkha of change.
What's the Pali word?
Dukkha.
For change?
Oh, for change, anicca. Anicca is interesting. That word anicca, and I know this from a Pali scholar friend of mine. A denotes the opposite of things, like the A in front of things. Nitya, I think, means certainty. Anicca means not certain. Very interesting. That's the term for impermanence. Impermanence is the first universal characteristic of existence. And that's what we start to perceive when we practice insight meditation or practice mindfulness. We start to perceive impermanence. And it can be quite freaky at first, because you realise, that falling leaf's impermanent. You start to generalise to everything. You notice the falling leaf, the autumn leaf is impermanent. That house on Wadago's Beach is impermanent. I'm also impermanent. Woo! That's freaky. It's the first characteristic of existence. The next characteristic of existence is, it's called dukkha. And in this case, it refers to uncertainty, unreliability. Things are, in and of themselves, not reliable to provide happiness and joy. When you depend on things that are changing, it's unreliable. So, I know I talked about that on the first night too. I think I gave you a pretty big download on the first night. Hopefully not too much. But anyway, what's another word I can use for anyway? Anybody got any ideas? Anyway.
Getting back on track.
Getting back on track. Anyway. No. Okay.
You can't say you wanted to segue back to your point. You can just say,
This and that, I could stroke my beard, Okay, I'll try and remember. Forgetting not to say anyway is dukkha. Because it causes some distress. Getting back on track. The dukkha of self. I started to talk about this the other night as well. And the dukkha of self brings out the hallmark feature of what the Buddha taught versus other teachings. And in the time of the Buddha, this was the big difference between what he was teaching and what the Hindus were teaching and the Vedas were teaching and so on. What was being taught in those traditions. Emptiness. Emptiness is the third characteristic of existence. Sometimes it's called anatta, here meaning not self. Atta refers to big self. Anatta refers to not self, no big self. And as a characteristic of existence, we see that there's nothing solid and lasting in anything. This is a really important feature to understand when we're talking about compassion. Because to understand true compassion, we need also to understand emptiness. The fact that nobody suffers. There's no one suffering. It's a hard one to get around, yet we still have the sensitivity to suffering and the wish to alleviate it. And ironically, when we can see through and perceive the not-self nature of self, or the not-self nature of suffering, then there's no suffering, or there's no dukkha. This might be a bit hard to get your head around, but I'll try and explain a little bit more, because it's useful to understand, especially as we're talking about compassion. So the other night I said, oh look, this lamp is not self. This lamp is impermanent. That's pretty easy to understand. This lamp is also unreliable. Well, I wouldn't want to invest my happiness in this lamp lasting forever. I mean, it's pretty nice. I'm thinking of getting one actually for my clinic, but it's not going to last forever. And as it is right now, I'll be parted from it pretty soon. Go in a couple of days. So I can't rely on it to give me enduring bliss and joy and satisfaction. So it's unreliable. Its nature is unreliable because it's impermanent. And it is also not self. It's not self because I've constructed this in my mind. This lamp, there is no such thing as a lamp. Lamp is a word. And the idea of emptiness is similar to the idea of interdependence, that there's no single thing in anything. There's no single thing in this lamp. There's no single thing in myself. And we can look at emptiness from a variety of different perspectives. One perspective is that it's a conglomerate of a number of things being put together. Like, if you look at the lamp, this lamp, it's got some metal and some springs and some screws and other bits and pieces and some wires. And if we broke it all up and put it out, we broke it down and unscrewed it all and put it out on the mat, we'd see that it's just this conglomeration of something. It's no longer a lamp, it's a bunch of wires and bits of steel and all the rest of it. That's one way of understanding emptiness. Another way of understanding emptiness is that things don't arise in and of themselves. They arise because of a number of conditions coming together. Just like when we looked at that credit card and the little mouse that was made out of clay, and some people had a lamp, and I think you had a cup. These things, not only are they made of a conglomerate of lots of things coming together, they are also made and constructed because of a number of things in history, in their history. They come about because of a number of things, conditions and causes. So when we look at ourselves, where are we? What are we? There was a practice that's done when you ordain as a monk or a nun, and we say something. We say part of a meditation practice. One of the mindfulness of body practices is called components of the body. And what you do with this practice is you imagine that you're putting parts of your body out there in front of you just so you can look at it. Like, you imagine, you put all your fingernails out there, and your teeth, and then you put out your organs and your intestines and bladder, spleen. Then you put your blood, spittle, urine, all the rest of it, mucus out there to see as a whole. This is called a mindfulness of body exercise. It's one of the subdomains of mindfulness. There's 6 subdomains of mindfulness. They include mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of actions, and so on and so forth. One of them is to look at your body as components. So coming back to this practice that happens when you're ordaining, what happens is you're chanting and someone's shaving your head. And you're saying hair of body, nails, teeth and skin. So before you're shaved, that's my hair. Then after they shave your hair, you look down and you see there's hair on the ground. That's not me anymore. A moment ago it was me, but now it's not me. And this relates to everything. I remember my teacher, Ajahn Ben. I've had many teachers, but Ajahn Ben was probably one of the most profound impacts on my life as a young person. He would often, I would say, I'm having a hard time, and he says, where is the person who's having a hard time? Who is the person? Not who, but where is the person who's having a hard time? Tell me where. Is it in your ear? Or is it in your mind? Where is it? If you do that with your body, then you do that with your mind and go, wow, how many self-concepts do you have in any one day? I have a few, I might be wandering around kind of aimlessly thinking, I feel a bit of a neurotic mess at the moment. Then other times I'm sitting up here teaching, I'm the Buddhist, I'm the Dharma teacher. Other times I might be meditating and I'm a meditator. Sometimes I think that I'm a dad, I'm a granddad, I'm a partner, I'm a psychologist, etc., etc. There's many different roles and self-concepts we have.
So there's no concept or idea of soul in Buddhism?
That's it, bingo. That's the difference. There is an understanding of self, like we have a continuity of self, but it is seen as a continuity. It's not seen as a solid, lasting thing. And I'll just be a bit kind of technical here. Hinduism, as an example, will see a soul going from one lifetime to the next. Yeah. So it's like, they may say your soul is like a person driving one vehicle in one day, and then stopping that vehicle falls apart, and then you hop into another car, and then you hop into another car, and hop into another car. They say it's like that. It's the same soul going through. Technically, with Buddhism, they would say something different. They would say there's no soul popping in and out. There's no thing that's continuing, but there is a continuity, like a flame of a candle. We might call ourselves the candle, and there's a flame that burns down. The flame of the candle might burn down. It's like energy. It's not the same flame. It doesn't last. It's a changing thing. It's an energy, and it might go on to another candle. It's more like that. If you can imagine billiard boards lined up, and someone hits the billiard ball at one end, and it looks like there's a ball that goes through the line of billiard balls and comes out the other end. It's like, it looks like it's one billiard ball going through, but in fact, it's just a transfer of energy. It's like that. That's the way Buddhists conceive of it. And that's what we start to realize when we practice mindfulness and insight meditation. We start to see the characteristics of existence. We start to see our impermanent nature, our dukkha nature, and our not-self nature. This is important to understand, especially in a talk about compassion, because you may say, well, who am I compassionate to? Well, you're not compassionate to anybody, but you still have compassion. And you think about the meaning of that term. It is sensitivity to dukkha and the commitment to alleviate it or cease it. So it makes no difference whether you think of you over there or me here. You's out there or me in here. It's just this understanding of suffering and the wish to alleviate it. And there's no self involved. In fact, when we cling on to a self, when we cling on to this continuity as a lasting, abiding, permanent thing, then that very clinging gives rise to suffering. And in fact, when we can realize emptiness, it gives rise to an enormous amount of freedom. Well, complete freedom. And it's not that we become, we don't, it's in fact we actually develop a stronger power or stronger dynamic ability to be ourselves, to use ourselves productively. It's not that we don't have a self. How can I explain this a bit more clearly? It's not that we become nobody or nothing. When we realize emptiness, we're actually more dynamic and free to be powerful in our expression of whatever we do. Like His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He realizes emptiness, yet he is incredibly powerful and effective in what he does. Because he realizes emptiness. We're not kind of caught up in a self that gets in the road, so to speak. I don't know if this might be really tricky. Is this okay? Can you understand?
There's a little spider.
There's a what? A little spider.
There is no spider.
Hello, little spider.
And I thought if it was okay while he was going to you, and I thought, I'll just wait. It's very close.
That's all right. He looks pretty happy there. Do you want me to get rid of him? If you, we'll keep an eye on it.
Yeah, but I don't want him to come towards me.
That's okay. Where's the you that you're... Sorry, I won't be nasty about it.
I thought I did really well,
You're doing very well.
Yeah. And I'm very impressed that I intuitively knew my pillow at that end of this mat beforehand.
Okay.
Can I just ask you?
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask in our time tomorrow, but now it's not the time. But how does reincarnation fit with that? So you're saying there's an energy of our soul that lives on, but our soul itself, as it is in this particular lifetime, ceases to exist when the body ceases to exist. Is that?
I tend not to kind of get into talking about reincarnation very much, because a lot of people get hung up on it. And I can talk about it technically, but in reality, I don't think about it very much. But for your information, and I can give you an essay on this. I wrote an essay 30 years ago for a university course I was doing. And you can get it from the net, I think. I think I've still got it on the net. But to continue, if you can think about it like energy, that one moment of energy will trigger another moment of energy. Like there's energy moving through things, like the billiard ball that looks like it's moving through, but it's not. So technically what will happen is that you'll have moments of mind and body, or form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations and consciousness. And that will stimulate another moment of body-mind experience. One moment leads to a next, leads to a next, leads to a next. So technically, and this may not sit completely well with the Tibetan approach to the bardos, but from a very, straight Abhidharma, which is Buddhist psychology perspective, you might be living one moment, and then the next moment you die, and that the condition you die in stimulates the next, or forms the condition for the next moment to arise. So if you live a life of mean nastiness, you're constantly creating that kind of energy about you, then when you die, you know, the states of mind that you're in then condition the states of mind that you'll have after the falling away of your body. And I think Western science can't quite get their head around that. The fact that maybe consciousness or this body-mind, the mind continuum may live on beyond a body. They can't separate the fact, they can't see the fact that there could be something living or a sentience and not having a body. That's simply it. I hope that alleviates your questioning about it. Yeah. So to continue, coming back to compassion. It's an important point to get an understanding of that when you're practicing compassion, because you can reify self. You can reify people and you can reify yourself as someone giving compassion or someone receiving compassion. But it doesn't mean, even if you don't reify it, even if you can see clearly the emptiness of it, and you still have suffering, then compassion will help to alleviate it. And I explained a little bit about how that does that from a very basic human sense the other night when I talked about the three circles, you know, the three emotional systems, you know, the threat system, the drive system, and the bonding, soothing, calming system. And the way compassion fits within those three circles is that compassion can help us connect with other humans, and that feeling of connection can help us feel safe, and it can alleviate suffering. It actually down-regulates threat. We actually feel safe, and it balances out those systems. It balances out the emotions. You probably don't, I don't know if I've explained that clearly enough. Maybe I'll go into it just a little bit more. The three emotional systems, the first system is the threat system, which is mostly about disgust, anger and fear. We need that emotional system to survive. That system is all about threat, and it can get out of balance. You know, we can have anxiety disorders, we can have anger control issues and all sorts of things. The next system is the kind of motivation system. It's the drive to go out and seek resources so that we can thrive. Emotions are all about survival, thriving, and connection and communication. Communication, in other words, connection. So the thriving systems are about seeking relationships, seeking resources so that we can live, and going out, being motivated to go out and get qualifications and so on and so forth. And of course, this system can get out of balance in the form of lots of addictions to pleasant experiences, and also when we get depressed, we can have no motivation. It can really diminish. The next system is the connective system, the affiliative system, or the soothing system. And we need this system in order to connect, in order to feel, to revive, to replenish, to have respite, to relax, to digest and procreate and so on. This is within those emotional systems. And being connected with another human helps us feel safe. When someone gives us compassion, we feel safe, so that we can actually rest and revive and survive, and more than survive, but we can connect. And that's in summary these three systems. Compassion is based on into the connection. So, to continue, we have the near and far enemies of compassion, and compassion definitely deals with the far enemies. The cultivation of compassion helps to alleviate the suffering that we have with masochism, sadism and cruelty. And it's direly needed in this world. We need compassion, we need more compassion. The near enemies of compassion, which look like compassion but are not really compassion, an example of that is what I mentioned before as empathy fatigue. And there's been some studies with Mathieu Ricard, with Tanya Singer, who's done some functional MRIs with monks, with Mathieu Ricard in particular, when he's cultivating empathy versus compassion. And what they've discovered is when he was just practicing empathy by thinking about some orphans in Europe who were, having a really difficult time, when he was thinking about them, and he was specifically asked not to cultivate compassion, he was just empathizing with them. He found it unbearable, very difficult to be with. So what was happening for him was his pain centers were being sparked neurologically. All these pain centers were being triggered, and that his mirror neurons were sparking off as well.
So is that because he was imagining himself?
Yeah, he was imagining it. Yeah, he was imagining it. He was imagining having empathy, and it was very difficult. He could hardly bear it. And I'm saying this is, when we have this, we have like empathy fatigue. We have pain when we have too much empathy. There's 3 types of empathy. First type of empathy is cognitive empathy, and I'm referring to Paul Ekman here. Paul Ekman's an expert on emotions. Cognitive empathy, where we know what another person is experiencing, and I think some psychopaths can have that. They can tune into knowing what another person is experiencing and then use that skill, that form of empathy, to actually harm another because they know their person's triggers. The next sort of empathy is emotional empathy, where we can feel what's going on with another person and resonate with that. And sometimes that can be useful, sometimes it cannot be so useful. It can lead to empathy fatigue, like, oh God, you walk out there and you're picking up on everyone's suffering. And then there's compassionate empathy, which is tuning into another person's experience, like being able to experience another person's experience as if it's your own, without losing that sense of as-ifness. And I'm just quoting Carl Rogers here in terms of the way he describes empathy. Yet there is also a wish to alleviate the suffering. And that's compassion. So when Matthew Ricard was doing the empathy one, he found himself getting really tired and unbearable to do it. And then they asked him to do the same thing, but with compassion this time. And it triggered a different circuitry in his brain, still related to mirror neurons, but there was different things happening, different parts of the brain were being activated. And subjectively he said he could sustain it, and it was actually uplifting. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about compassion. So, to continue. Compassion maybe I'll tell you. Now, I've only got a couple of minutes to finish the talk. As if I stayed within the hour. Oh, but we lost a bit of time putting the spider out, didn't we? So can I go over time a little bit? Yeah. So, with the Theravadan tradition, the way we cultivate compassion is by thinking of someone who is suffering, or turning our attention to suffering in general, or dukkha. And as you know, that could be within this being that we call ourselves, or it could be with another. That triggering is called kindling. It's like a kindling. And then if you start to feel the compassion arising in your heart, then you nourish and keep it going. You sustain it. You sustain it with bringing your attention back to it. That's a very simple approach from the Theravadan Buddhist perspective. And of course it's much more than just that. You notice your heart's response in daily life, because it is a natural tendency for us to feel compassion, I think. And I often use the example of, say, when you're walking along the street and someone starts to stumble and fall, the natural tendency for us, for most people often, is to reach out and want to help. And I noticed how many people responded this afternoon when Monique walked in the room and said, "Oh, you know, I've got to go, I need some help." Everyone sort of, there was an immediate kind of yearning to help. We could witness suffering. Monique was suffering, she was going through her own ordeal. We could identify it, we could perceive it, we were sensitive to it, and we had a natural response to want to respond, to want to relieve that suffering. I mean, I wanted to give her a hug, and I gave her, you know, it just happened, it's hugging, and, you know, we wanted to soothe, and we wanted to calm, and we wanted to help in whatever way we could. So, it's useful to start where you're at, just quoting Pema Chodron then, again. So when you can start to see compassion arising in daily life, it's useful to become very familiar with that, to notice it, and to nourish it, and remember it. And it is an uplifting quality, even though it's not completely, you know, you don't want other people to suffer, but when you're perceiving compassion, when you're having compassion for another person suffering, it is somehow uplifting. It is actually a divine abode, because you feel empowered. You feel the capacity to act. And even if you're sitting on a hill somewhere meditating, there's still that capacity to do something. The intention is still strong. It's an intentional quality. Actually, these 4 heart qualities are mostly intentional in nature. They're the aspirations to help. The Tibetan tradition, the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, sees compassion as a central feature in their whole approach. From the Theravadan perspective, it's being able to notice compassion arising and then cultivate it to make it stronger. With the Tibetan tradition, it's a little bit different. The way they see it in the Tibetan traditions is that it's like 2 wings on a bird, where compassion is one wing and wisdom is the other wing. You need both wisdom and compassion to balance each other. Otherwise, compassion can become idiot compassion. I'm just quoting His Holiness the Dalai Lama there. It can be like compassion without wisdom is like the false enemy, it's like the near enemy of compassion. It's like rescuing and jumping in a stupid way, or in a silly way. They say that these 2 wings of the bird they need both wings in order for the bird to fly. And in Tibetan Buddhism, it's not so much about cultivating, but more of an uncovering what's already there. Like, there's the perspective that the Tibetan Buddhists take, is that we're already awakened, we already have a compassionate heart. We're already fully manifest as the Buddha, you know, with compassion, wisdom, and kindness, and all these qualities. And it's just a matter of us to uncover that, to move away the obstructions that are blocking that. I think both of them are true, you know. They're both ways for us to cultivate it and to awaken to compassion. And with the Tibetan tradition, there's a whole smorgasbord of practices. There's numerous practices about cultivating compassion. One practice that I really like is called Tonglen. And Tonglen is where you understand that the transformative power of suffering. You understand the sequence of the four truths. Remember how I spoke about that on the first night? That suffering can actually lead to enlightenment eventually. We need it. In order to be free from suffering, we first must understand suffering. So, with understanding that, with Tonglen, it's like when you perceive some suffering, you breathe it in and you understand it. You sit with it, you be with it, and in the being with it and the understanding of it, it transforms to liberation. So they have practices around this, and literally it's like you imagine all the suffering in the world and you breathe it in to a pure heart. It can be quite risky and dangerous. When I first learnt this in 1975 with Lama Yeshe and Lama Zopa, they said, "Oh, be careful, this is really dangerous." So I put it aside for about 30 years. And then I took it up again when I was on a retreat with Alan Wallace. And he spoke about it in a different way, in a way that I could feel like I could understand and skillfully utilise. And the way he talked about it was, first of all, start with your own suffering. And you breathe it in. In other words, you turn your attention to it and you sit with it. You sit with it. And you sit with it with an awakened mind, with the qualities of awakening. And in that sitting with it, it actually transforms to awakening. That makes sense? And only when you can do that, or when you can do that, then you might notice that it happens naturally with others. And I noticed this happening naturally with others when I was sitting with patients or clients. They're coming in and they've just got lots of suffering, and I'm just going, I awaken a compassionate heart, an awakened heart. And I sit there and it feels like I'm breathing it in, and it's transforming in my heart. And as I imagine that I'm breathing it in, and as I'm breathing it in, they're being relieved of their suffering. It's a really interesting practice. That's one of the many. There's another really wonderful practice that they have, or series, whole raft of practices. And these ones are the classic deity practices. And I've done these practices over many years, and every now and then I dip into them and do them a bit more. And they involve a mantra, like White Tara, or Avalokitesvara, or Chenrezig. And what happens here is you visualize and you imagine the deity of compassion. A deity is like a symbolic representation of compassion. Sometimes people think there's an actual being out there. Other times it's like your own projection. Either way, it works. So you imagine this deity of compassion, and I imagine White Tara, and I've got pictures of White Tara, and she's quite beautiful. And there's Kuan Yin's another one. Kuan Yin's listening to the suffering of the earth, and she's actually sitting, I think she's sitting with the other leg down though. Sitting a bit like, oh, this knee's a bit hard. Sitting like this somehow. Like this, listening to the suffering of the world. And she's radiating compassion. White Tara, she's not sitting like this, but she's sitting and she's white and she's got this beautiful face. And she's this glowing compassion. So I imagine she's there, and whenever I'm having a hard time, I feel the compassion from this symbolic being that I've created coming into me, and I'm experiencing compassion like receiving compassion, and it's healing me, it's soothing me, it's calming me, it's giving me just what I need. I'm not getting rid of my suffering, I'm just managing it, working with it. Then what happens in this process of this meditation, I'll also be saying a mantra, and with Tara it's Om Tare Tu Tare Tu Re Soha. Om Tare Tu Tare Tu Re Soha. Om Tare Tu Tare Tu Re Soha. So I'm imagining all this light coming in. Then I imagine that this being Tara comes across and moves down to my crown chakra, moves into my heart, and I become Tara. And then I radiate loving kindness and compassion to all beings. This is the practice. It's really good. It really works. It makes you feel really good. And then you might walk out in the world and it's called a tantra practice, becoming one with. You actually feel like you're White Tara walking around the streets. You know, people are suffering, radiating this loving kindness and compassion. These are just some of the many practices that you can do. So, compassion is really important. There's so much suffering in the world. There's so much dukkha, both the gross dukkha, the dukkha of impermanence, the dukkha of clinging to a self, that what we need is lots of compassion, both to ourselves and to other beings. And it is miraculously transformative, healing and liberating. So let's sit quietly.